Okay, I'm going to be talking to you about the subject matter of the African vampire. My subtitle, as you can see, is From the Fang to the Needle. The meaning of that will hopefully become clear in the next 5 minutes or so. And I'm giving you a painting here from mid-century Africa portraying two African vampires, and I'm putting that in quotation marks. And as you'll see, these are not cape-wearing, befanged aristocrats. They're wearing uniforms. They're colonial bureaucrats. The meaning of that will also become clear, I think, in the next 5 to 10 minutes. Just one kind of caveat. I decided for this talk that I was going to basically put together a PowerPoint presentation and just talk over it. I've got some rough notes. I thought I'd got it down to 40 minutes. I did a trial run this morning and it went way over time. So as I go through this, I'm actually going to skip several slides to just try and keep things to a reasonable time. I may come back to some of these slides in the Q&A, and if you're interested in something, you're welcome to note it down and I'll come back to it. I'm going to begin. Now I can't change my slide. Okay. So I'm going to begin, and this is not an academic quote. This is a quote I found about the African vampire from a website called greydogtales.com. One of you may be involved in this website. I'm not sure. It's quite interesting. But it gives a very interesting take on the African vampire that I partly agree with, but I'm fundamentally going to be arguing against. And I've just realized that, okay, I can't actually read my own quote, so I need to minimize the boxes. There we go. Okay, so it's from a blog entry entitled The African Vampire, or Where No Draculas Roam. Today's bold assertion: there never was an African vampire. Africa is hardly short of powerful and worrying myths or tales of blood drinking, psychic draining, and the like. But vampires, we shall argue not. And if there are such creatures there today, then they are the matter of the new urban myth, the product of colonial-era fears, or adaptations of folklore for modern fantasy and horror stories. Okay, now I do agree that there are no Draculas roaming in Africa. If you think about Dracula in the terms of this kind of seductive aristocrat who lives in a castle and sleeps in a coffin and is shuns daylight and is afraid of crucifixes, these creatures do not, as far as I know, exist in Africa. But my counter-argument would also be that there are no Draculas in the Balkans either. And the Balkans, of course, are the origin of the European vampire stories. And the initial European vampire stories concern fundamentally Balkan peasants, Orthodox Christian Serbian peasants who rise from the grave and suck blood from family members. So I want to claim that I don't think Dracula is the best template to use to adjudicate whether or not something is a vampire. Dracula is a very specific kind of literary elaboration of that folk vampire that's gone through Polidori and gone through European Romanticism and taken on a very specific form. He's not a template for the vampire. If we look at these original Balkan vampire myths, there's a huge amount of crossover with African vampires. The second thing I kind of want to take issue with here is this idea that we should dismiss African vampires because they're the product of colonial-era fears. And I am going to argue that vampires in Africa are inextricably connected to colonialism or the aftermaths of colonialism. But then so too are European vampires. So the initial Balkan vampire that emerges in the 17th and 18th centuries, it emerges from territory that had been shunted back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and these encounters with kind of this new Western rationality emerging from Europe and these very conservative Christian Serbian communities. So that comes out of a certain kind of colonial environment. And of course, Stoker himself was Irish. He was heavily involved in the cause of Irish independence. His inspiration for Dracula, as far as I understand it, was some travels he had taken to Eastern Europe, where we had seen Eastern European peasants and immediately identified their situation with the Irish Catholic peasantry, and he looked at Orthodox Christian ceremonies and immediately identified that with the Catholic Church in Ireland. So Dracula, Stoker himself and his creation, Dracula, are very much the product of colonial-era fears. So I don't think that's any reason to dismiss the vampire. In fact, I think that makes a stronger case for the African vampire. The one thing I do agree with here, which I think is very important, is I don't think we should take, there's a whole body of pre-colonial myths in Africa of blood drinking or psychic draining creatures that belong to pre-colonial folklore. I don't think we should call those vampires. I think that's a form of epistemic colonization or conceptual colonization. So I'm going to leave those. That's a very rich body of imagery. I'm going to leave that out of today's talk. Now, the talk's going to be divided into two sections. The first section is kind of going to be an overview of other people's work, and it's going to look at an indigenous or folk tradition of the African vampire that emerges in the mid-20th century in East and Central Africa primarily, and it's produced by Black Africans almost entirely about white settlers, or white colonists, I should say, instead. And in the second section of the talk, I'm going to shift gears quite sharply and look at a very different kind of literary tradition that self-consciously takes the European vampire figure and transplants it into Africa. And I'm going to look in some detail at two texts set in 21st century Johannesburg by white South Africans. And this is much more my own work, so I'll go into quite a bit more detail about this. There are two broad arguments I want to make about the African vampire before I really get into the nitty-gritty. Obviously, as I said, I think African vampires are inextricably connected to colonialism, but there's some very interesting ramifications of this. One of the ramifications is that in the colonial sphere, blood has a very particular meaning. Blood in the colonial imagination or the imperial imagination is not simply a symbol for race, it actually is. It is race. It's thought of as race. So there are all kinds of anxieties in the colonial imagination about the mixture of blood or about miscegenation. Now, of course, once you introduce a vampire into this kind of context, the vampire is a creature who biologically subsists on blood. So blood becomes this biological substance that is then transferred between different races, vampire and human, if you want to think of it that way. So the vampire becomes this vessel containing mixed bloods. And I think this is very important because the vampire, when considered as a biological creature, automatically disrupts this colonial imaginary of blood. The vampire is inherently a kind of miscegenated creature, if you want to think about it that way. Now, the other larger argument I want to make has to do with the way in which African vampires are almost invariably these rigid, static creatures who do not or cannot transform. Now, if you think back to Dracula, Dracula is quite a protean figure. He can change shape. He changes country. The African vampires, and one of the big dilemmas in the African vampire, as I'll talk about later on, is that they're kind of trapped in a very rigid kind of identity and a rigid form of being. I'll come back to this, especially in the second half of the talk. I'm going to gloss over this Hart and Negri quote, but I do want to make the point that vampires in general, my apologies, vampires in general tend to emerge in social situations of unrest and tumult, where fundamental social entities are experiencing ruptures and transgressions. Vampires tend to emerge in that kind of social context. I don't think that's not an original claim. I'm sure you're all aware of this. So let me dig into the first section of the talk, and you'll see where I got the title image from. This is a really interesting book by a historian, Louise White, called Speaking with Vampires. It came out in the year 2000. And what she's done is she's focused on this very large archive of stories that emerge in the rumor and gossip of colonial Africa, beginning around the time of World War I, and then really kind of exploding in the quarter century or so after World War I. And this is a very important time in African colonial history because it's when African nations are effectively fully conscripted into European colonial modernity. Obviously, that a lot of that is triggered by World War I. And she deals with a whole series of stories, and I'm going to have to give you a very crude summary of what she does, but she deals with a whole series of stories in which essentially Black people will be talking about white doctors or firemen or game rangers or other members of the colonial bureaucracy who are said to consume the blood of Black people. And they consume the blood with various technological apparatuses. So they'll use needles, they'll use pipes, they'll drain the blood into vats, and then they'll take this blood away to some kind of secret facility where they'll get up to all kinds of illicit activities with the blood, and there are various variations on all the elements of these stories. But those are the basics of the stories. There are a few methodological issues that Louise White needs to confront when she kind of classes these as a genre of vampire stories. The first of these issues is that none of these creatures actually go by the name of vampire, which is obviously a European term. They go by a variety of local names: Mumiani, Wazimamoto, Banyana. And these are names that generally signify positions in the colonial bureaucracy. So a Wazimamoto is a one word for a fireman. I think it changes depending on the context in Africa. Banyana is generally used to refer to game rangers. So they're separated from traditional African myths and very much attached to the colonial bureaucracy, but they're not called vampires. So why use the term vampires? White is worried that she's going to lose a certain specificity in calling them vampires, but she gives a very interesting reason that I'm going to just summarize for you. One reason is that this term, it's a widespread term. We all know what a vampire is, and it conveys some of the essential features of these creatures. Okay, so we don't have the fangs and we don't have the aristocratic allure, but we have some other essential features. We have this idea of the international mobility of these beings. We have an idea of separate races coexisting side by side, usually one race exploiting the other in some form or other. We've got an idea of violations of space, in particular of personal or private space. And then you've got this idea of the capture of vulnerable bodies and the extraction of precious bodily fluid from them. And the term vampire encapsulates all of this very nicely and gives it a kind of critical purchase, I think, which is very important. A second reason that's just as important is that I think when these stories were first documented, there was a common tendency to read them as misunderstandings or bot descriptions of Western medical technology. Rethinking them as vampire stories allows us to think of them in a much more sophisticated way, as ways of negotiating and understanding the ruptures entailed by colonial modernity, of understanding the new regimes of power, labor, and time that were capturing Black Africans. And a final point, which I think is also very important, is the vampire then distinguishes these stories from stories of witches, which are very populous in Africa and also in Europe, I should say. In the Balkans, vampire stories also came to replace stories of witchcraft in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the African context, these stories tend to exist side by side, but stories of witches tend to concern ruptures or problems or dangers coming from within the community. The witches were always people you knew, they were kin. So it talked about dangers from the community coming from within, whereas vampires always indicated an external force. And I think one of the key things in this quote is that blood-sucking firemen had none of the personal malice of witches. It was a job. It did not imperil people in tense relationships. It imperiled everyone. So there's a kind of impersonal aspect to the African vampire that is not present in the witch. The witch is very personal and is motivated by personal malice. The vampire is something who's part of an external system. So you can clearly see how that might work very well as a way of coming to terms with European colonialism. I'm now going to go through a handful of stories, and I'm going to go through these very quickly, and I'm not going to do them justice, but it'll just give you a sense of the kind of way in which Louise White is using these stories and what's actually going on in these stories. I'll read these first two together. A story from Zambia, I think this is from the 30s. Africans claimed their blood was taken and their bodies left for dead to make cough drops for Europeans. A similar story from Tanganyika. It was believed that African blood was taken to urban hospitals and there converted into red capsules. The pills were taken on a regular basis by Europeans who needed these potations to stay alive in Africa. Okay, so first story, I think, it's a wonderful description of the basically extractive relationship of European colonialism. It's a description at a surface level. It seems to be a misunderstanding of what's going on when European medical orderlies were taking blood from Africans. But it has a very clear metaphorical meaning that describes the way in which Africans were exploited in order to create luxury commodity for Europeans, the cough drops representing this kind of luxury commodity. And the second story is a kind of variation on the theme, but it's got this wonderful twist because it suggests here that the reason that Europeans are exploiting Africans is precisely because they're weak. They need to drink they need to drink these pills. They need to eat pills made of African blood in order to survive in Africa with their weakened constitution. So it's a story that grants the teller a certain form of agency in this very asymmetrical, exploitative relationship. Two somewhat different stories that really get to the nitty-gritty of the blood-sucking, both from Kenya. Wazimamoto entered the houses of women as they slept, carrying a sort of sucking rubber tube that they would stick in your hands while you were asleep and draw the blood out of your body and leave you there. And eventually you would die. Okay, again, one could, in a naive way, just read this as a misunderstanding of Western medical procedures. This might be a description of a blood transfusion that is not fully understood. But White claims this is not the case. And I think she's right. She said, the Africans had a very good understanding of what was going on with blood tests and blood transfusions. And what she reads this as is a kind of parody of Western medical technology. And it's a story that raises questions about who has the right or the power to administer medicine, who has the right to lay claim to regimes of bodily health. And one of the recurrent themes in all these stories is their ways of explaining why white people have the upper hand over Black people in Africa. In none of these stories are these white vampires more intelligent or more powerful than Africans. They simply seem to possess technologies and tools and drugs that allow them to exploit Africans. Okay, and you'll notice here into this story, this kind of technological element of the African vampire starts entering. The second story here, a fire engine or medical vehicle patrolling the streets in the dead of night, should it come upon a straggler, draws from his veins all his blood with a rubber pump, leaving his body in the gutter, limp and drained. I think one of the things this is getting at, again, is these new forms of vast, impersonalized colonial power that are really kind of disrupting the organic modes of traditional African life. One of the things that's very interesting about this story is this idea, it brings up this idea of the closed space. So what goes on inside the ambulance, or what goes on inside the fire engine? And one of the things that happens with the kind of instantiation of colonial regimes and the conscription of Black Africans into these colonial regimes is you're suddenly entering into these spaces where work is obscured or work is concealed. So Black Africans who would take jobs as nurses or medical orderlies in these big colonial medical institutions would suddenly be inside these medical vehicles. No one really knew what was going on in these medical vehicles. So it's a story that also kind of gets at this kind of division of space in the colonial environment. I'll look at one final story that also deals with these new regimes of work. And this is a story that it's about fire stations. And one of the things that happened is that Black Africans would be hired to work in these fire stations, and they'd be given very repetitive mechanical jobs. So they'd be asked to spend 7 hours a day just polishing the fire engine. They'd be asked to give reports every 15 minutes throughout the day and throughout the night. So repetitive, seemingly meaningless tasks. But by the same token, they'd be on a wage labor. So they'd be getting far more money than they would be getting for doing casual manual labor. So I'll just read out the story and talk about how it relates to this. And this is a story obviously told by someone who's been employed by a fire station. Occasionally, we went down to the pits underneath the fire stations, and if we were lucky, we saw blood sucking in progress and nothing more. The blood was sucked from the victims until they were considered useless. When that day came, they would die and then be buried in a more secret place known only to the government. Okay, there are many things I could say about the story. I want to talk about two things in particular. I think one thing the story brings up is the sense that there's something hidden and illicit going on in this work process, where you spend an entire day polishing a fire engine and then you get given a whole vast amount of money. There's a sense that something else must be going on. And the vampire story kind of emerges to explain this vampire pit underneath the fire station. I think another element of the story that's also interesting is it addresses the way in which these new mechanical regimes of work take over the human body. So it's about the mechanization of labor, which is construed as a form of blood sucking until your body has been completely drained. And then you're buried somewhere that only the government knows. So you're wrenched from your own community. So what are the basic functions of these vampire stories? I'm going to read over a couple of broad ideas that I'm taking from Louise White, and also from another scholar who writes on African vampire stories, David McNally. One of the functions of these stories is that they're ways of talking about new ideas and relationships that beg description. So new relationships that formed in the colonial sphere, these strange, commodified, exploitative relationships. You needed to find a language to talk about them. They'd express lingering anxieties about extraction, harm, and uncertainty. I think that's very clear. And they'd chronicle the social reorganization and conscription into the new colonial work economy. Now, the vampires here, and I think this is important, what I would add, this is my idea, they're not allegories for colonialism, as one might expect. They rather function as glimpses into the lived experience under colonialism, the lived experience of Black Africans under colonialism. That's what these vampire stories are really about. The vampires are not allegories for colonials. They are ways of actually thinking of and working through the experience of being colonized. A very brief, so we've reached a point where we can lay out some very clear distinctions between the African vampire and the European vampire. And as we move from the African vampire to the European vampire, we move from these kind of sensual, aristocratic, highly individuated beings to this bureaucratic, impersonal beings. We move from the castle or the coffin to the government institute. We move from forms of animal locomotion like flight to mechanized locomotion. And we move from the fang to the needle, hence the subtitle of my talk. So these African vampires have kind of technological prostheses that they need in order to do their vampiric work. One of the very interesting points that Louise White makes about the story is that for us, as maybe modern Western readers of these stories, the horror of the vampire seems to have to do with its consumption of blood. But she says it's entirely possible that for the tellers of these stories, the horror was not about the consumption of blood, but it was about the use of technology. It was the needles and the cars and the electricity. That was the source of the Gothic horror, which is a very interesting suggestion that may again come into play in the second half of my talk. And then I just want to reinforce this idea that these vampires are very static, rigid creatures. They're not the protean creatures of 19th century European literature. Okay, so I'm going to shift over to the second part of my talk, which has much more to do with my own personal research. I'm calling this translated and transposed vampires because these are two texts. One is a film, one is a graphic novel, both from 2010, and they both take the template of the European vampire and place it in an African context. And in this particular case, the context is Johannesburg in the 21st century. I was going to do a whole segment on Johannesburg as a vampire city. I don't really have time to do that, but I'll just give you a 1-minute version of it. This is a kind of shot of the old inner city of Johannesburg, and underneath these buildings is a whole warren of mine shafts and mining tunnels. This city was almost entirely erected on the wealth of enormous gold deposits that were extracted from the ground by the exploitation of very cheap black labor for the benefit of a white minority that ended up throughout the course of the 20th century leading quite comfortable lives. So there's a very vampiric element to the city itself. The city center has now emptied out of white people. There's been an enormous white flight. They've moved to the suburbs, and the city center is now primarily the home of working class or even lumpen proletariat, Black Africans, often migrants from other African countries. So it's got a very different feel to it. I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff and get straight into this movie. As I said, this movie takes up the European vampire figure very self-consciously. It's set in present-day downtown Johannesburg, and we're introduced to a coven of vampires that live in one of these kind of abandoned buildings in the old city center. Now, the plot of this, the main drama of this film is triggered by a scientific or a medical discovery. So a doctor who's actually researching a cure for HIV stumbles upon the possibility of creating a serum that will give these vampires an immunity to daylight. So it's essentially a day-walking serum. And this sets off a huge conflict within the vampire community. The older establishment reject the serum. They basically say, look, we already live in harmony. There's a kind of balance between human and vampire that we mustn't upset. And then there's a young upstart who is the antagonist of this film named Borlak, who's essentially a vampire supremacist. He wants to use the day-walking serum to dominate human beings for good, to fully exploit them. Now, there's a very clear allegory of South Africa's racial politics at play right in the opening of this film. Borlak represents very clearly a naked, predatory white supremacism. Okay, he's a vampire supremacist. But the vampire establishment he's arguing against is not necessarily any better. They're advocating for harmony between vampire and human. They're advocating for the idea of the two races living alongside one another. And if you know anything about South African history, that is almost exactly how the apartheid regime described itself. Apartheid was a policy of good neighborliness. It was a policy of separate development and living together, which really just masked a different form of exploitation, which was just as malicious, but it had a kind of veneer over the top of it. And there's even a sense in which the head of the vampire establishment recognizes this when he says, look, we already control the humans. We don't need to fully dominate them. So there's a very clear echo, I think, here of kind of official apartheid policy. So the film is opened with these two vampire factions, the supremacists and the moderates, but neither of them are good. They're both kind of problematic from a political perspective. There's a wonderful scene at the opening of the film where two young vampires, including the protagonist of the film, who's this vampire here, his name is Billy, they kind of do parkour through the center of the city, and then they gaze out from the city center into the new center of wealth in Johannesburg, and they're gazing out into the northern suburbs, and this is the suburb of Sandton. This is where all the capital has migrated in the last 30 years as white people have fled the city center and black people have moved in. Now, I think this scene, this quite potent scene, makes it very clear that this film's interests are partly an allegory of, how could I put it? They're an allegory of post-apartheid whiteness. So there's this anxiety that white South Africans have about their loss of centrality in South Africa, about their loss of power, and a potential and imminent loss of access to wealth. So it makes it clear that this movie is going to be in some degree about whiteness and white identity, and that the vampires are correlated with whiteness. There are one or two black vampires in this film, but they're very low down on the vampire hierarchy. Now, the main plot of the film is quite, it's a bit ridiculous, but I'm going to just explain it. This young vampire, Billy, what's his name? Billy, not Willie, goes out on an evening in the suburbs and meets a young human woman, Jenny, with whom he falls in love and decides he doesn't want to exploit her for her love. He wants to protect her from the other vampires. And this, of course, immediately sets him up on a collision course with the vampire supremacist represented by Borlak. And he spends much of the film trying to protect her from the depredations of Borlak. I'm going to skip most of that. But clearly he's transgressed in that he's crossed racial boundaries. He's crossed the vampire-human boundary, which I think in this film becomes very much an allegory for a boundary between black and white. And that's going to become very clear soon enough. At the end of the film, Billy is captured by Borlak's henchmen. And there's a very bizarre scene where Borlak is brandishing this day-walking serum. But the problem with the serum is it hasn't yet been perfected. So every time he's used it on a vampire, the vampire has died in agony. So he injects Billy with the serum, anticipating that Billy too will die in agony. Billy doesn't die. In fact, he jumps up and fights back. The fight eventually moves outside of the building into daylight. And as we move into daylight, we suddenly realize that the serum has actually taken effect on Billy. He is immune to sunlight, and Borlak immolates. Okay, so that is the end of Borlak. And we have Billy, who's this new form of vampire, who can now kind of daywalk, who can now coexist with the humans. You might expect that the film would conclude with some kind of consummation of the relationship between Billy and his human girlfriend, Jenny, but it doesn't. Jenny dies in this final battle, and the final scene of the film is very interesting. It suddenly changes tack, and we have Billy standing in the daylight, looking out over Johannesburg alongside a black human, and this black human is a vampire hunter. So it's a certain kind of image of racial reconciliation in which black is standing alongside white, in which a vampire is standing alongside a vampire hunter. And there's a certain kind of fantasy or desire in the film that white South Africans may somehow be able to shed their vampiric essences and stand alongside black South Africans in this new South Africa. Now, it's not fully worked out. There are huge amounts of incoherence in the film. Presumably, Billy still needs blood to survive. It's not clear how that's going to be sorted out. There's another strange detail in the film that I find very problematic. There's a kind of HIV narrative running through the film. The daywalking serum is discovered by a doctor who's searching for a cure for HIV, and somehow happens upon the daywalking serum. But the vampires in this film are immune to HIV, which is a very strange and dissonant narrative choice if you're going to make this an allegory about race, because it suggests that vampires and humans are fundamentally ontological different. They face a different set of problems, a different set of material problems. They don't inhabit the same life world. Now, I bring up this HIV subplot because the final work I want to talk about, which I think is fascinating, it does, I think, the most interesting thing with the vampire in Africa that I have come across, also has an HIV subplot, but it does something very different with it. It's a graphic novel that came out in 2010. Very sadly, it's out of print. It was self-published. Only 1,000 copies were printed. As I said, I think it's a real shame. It's a very well done graphic novel. It's written by two young South African, white South Africans, Joshua Brody, Daniel Brody and Joshua Reba. And the conceit here is quite clever. So the conceit is that Jan van Riebeeck, who's the figure you see here, Jan van Riebeeck is the leader of the first group of Dutch settlers who colonized the Cape of Good Hope in 1642. The conceit is that he is a vampire. And he brings the vampire gene to Africa. So he lands at the Cape Colony. He starts biting young Dutch settlers. And before you know it, the vampire gene has spread everywhere. He is eventually murdered by one of the very people he's transformed into a vampire, but it's too late. The vampire gene has spread. So it's a very clever idea. It's not doing that much in terms of originality with the vampire, which got the vampire as colonists. It's a very, somewhat cliched way of using the vampire, although it's striking. I think the real cleverness of this graphic novel occurs when we jump a couple of centuries into the future, and we're in 21st century Johannesburg, and we meet the last remaining descendants of Jan van Riebeeck, who are still living in South Africa. And they're holed up in a mansion in Westcliff, which is quite a wealthy, older, generally white suburb of Johannesburg. And these vampires are sick, and they're miserable, and they're whining, and they're complaining. There's nothing noble or romantic about these vampires. And here's where I think that the novel is very clever. These vampires have contracted a disease that the novel refers to as immunodeficiency disorder, or immunodeficiency virus, IDV, which is a very clear play on HIV. And obviously, if you're going to think the vampire within an early 21st century context, particularly in Africa, if the vampire is feeding on blood, it's going to get infected. Now, I don't think this is an HIV story. I think it's using this disease of IDV in order to do something very clever, a very clever deconstruction of the vampire figure. Now, what is this deconstruction of the vampire figure? There's a certain kind of contradiction within the self-fashioning of the vampire. The vampire, certainly as we know the vampires through European and North American pop culture, the vampire fashions him or herself as kind of autonomous, Apollonian, inviolable, in control of him or herself. So this is, the classic self-fashioning of the vampire. The vampire is the one doing the penetrating. The vampire is the apex predator. By placing these vampires in this network of diseased bloods, you suddenly realize that this vampire is not the one doing the penetrating. The vampire is also the one being penetrated by foreign bloods, by foreign viruses, amongst other things. So it suddenly upends this vampiric illusion of autonomy and this illusion of being an apex predator. These vampires suddenly become vulnerable. And the comic develops this in two very interesting ways. I think I'll be 5 more minutes. I'm going to try and get through this quickly. Firstly, these vampires need ARVs to survive. So they're dependent on medication to survive. And of course, this dependence on medication is one of the surest signs of one's imbrication within complex social networks. So these vampires are dependent on social networks. And you can see the speech bubble here. I shouldn't have to take this crap. I'm a vampire. This affronts the self-image of the vampire. A second elaboration of this new situation of the vampires is the way they feed. They can't feed in the kind of romantic way that the 19th century vampire feeds, by kind of seducing nubile young women or slipping through windows. They're too weak and depleted and honestly lacking charisma to be able to do that. So they have to negotiate and hustle to survive. So they've made a deal with the prison warden of a top security prison in Johannesburg, and you'll see they get around by motorcycle. they've made a deal to feed on the blood of troublesome prisoners. So there's a scene where they're in the basement interrogation room of this prison, and they're just feasting away. There's nothing romantic about this. There's nothing romantic about this form of predation. It's just an ugly form of predatory behavior. And in a way, what happens here is the vampires have just become common predators. They're one more vampiric entity amongst a whole host of vampiric entities in 21st century South Africa. And I would say maybe Africa as a whole, and maybe the globe as a whole. Vampirism is no longer extraordinary. There's a wonderful scene here where one of the vampires in this frenzy actually breaks through the one-way mirror and starts feasting on an unauthorized prisoner that he's not allowed to feast on. And there's a clear visual echo of Van Riebeck here, who's kind of noble and in control of himself versus this very degraded vampire here. Now, the plot point here concerns HIV, and it's very clever. It's a little bit complicated. I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but at a certain point, the novel is going to take us into the cellular element of the vampiric body and the human body. The plot point here is the vampires have found a doctor who claims he's going to be able to cure them of IDV. And he's going to do this by experimenting on a human patient, and he's going to inject vampire blood into this human patient until he finds a synthesis that the vampires then plan to harvest. So that's what they're doing here. They've kidnapped this human guinea pig, and they're going to harvest his blood in order to cure themselves of IDV. Now, one of the things in this kind of remarkable passage when we go into the cellular level and see these vampire cells kind of colonizing the body of this young human, one of the effects of this is that it very clearly reveals that vampirism itself is a viral form. And it raises the question of, given the fact that these vampires have access to medical technology, why are they not trying to cure themselves of vampirism? Why are they trying to cure themselves of IDV? The answer to this question is, I think, quite simple. It's because they're too attached to the image they have of themselves. They're unable to imagine any kind of transformation. But I think the irony is that this IDV actually, in a way, makes them more human. It makes them mortal. It makes them vulnerable. It forces them to engage in a kind of common world, in a world of commerce and negotiation with human beings. So it knocks them off their pedestal or their perch. The vampires at the end of this novel are no longer, well, at the beginning of this novel, they're no longer a separate race. They're caught up in a common project with human beings. Now, to conclude all of this, I'm going to try and wrap all of these things together. I began by saying that some of these African vampire tales were ways of negotiating and describing a world in tumult, this kind of organic African world under the pressure of the invasions and transgressions of European colonial capitalist modernity. Now, you could see these 21st century vampire tales by white South Africans as also negotiating a world in tumult, but it's a very different kind of world, because the world that's being transgressed and threatened is precisely the world of the vampires. These are creatures, and I've got a quote from Interview with the Vampire, a very different film. But it gets at one of the anxieties of the vampire. The world changes, we do not. Therein lies the irony that kills us. This problem of the vampire is that they can't keep up with change. And I think one of the things that's happening here is both of these two South African vampire texts are trying to imagine how white people can think themselves out of their vampiric subjectivities. Now, at the end of the film Rebirth, there's a kind of somewhat sentimental and utopian idea that this white vampire has kind of transcended his vampirism. The comic book has a much darker take on this. The vampires in the comic book are not exclusively white. In fact, the lead vampire, who is pictured here, is black. So they're a multiracial group. So there's a sense here that vampiric subjectivity has extended its province beyond white people and now encompasses everyone. Everyone is kind of conscripted into vampirism. It's a much larger field. And in the final frame of the novel, which is written in, it's a very sketched out black and white frame, this human subject that the vampires have been experimenting on has escaped. And in the final frame of the novel, he suddenly realizes he's turning into a vampire. So instead of overcoming vampireness, this book ends with the sense that vampireness is expanding its reach everywhere. And this human character is very clearly marked in the novel as multiracial. So there's a much larger anxiety. It's not just enough for white people to shed their vampiric subjectivity. There's a sense that vampirism is far more deeply embedded in society at large. And the book ends on this very ambiguous and dark note that is really about the difficulty of truly imagining a future beyond the vampiric. Okay, so I'm going to end there. I probably went over time. I'm almost sure I did. I apologize about that.